Hi, I'm Dennis from Plain Truth Ministry. Welcome to Friday in the Word. I was looking through Paul's letter to the Galatians this week and was struck by a passage in the second chapter, verses 11 through 21. And it reminded me of the strength of Paul's conviction to the gospel. Paul had spent the early part of the letter talking about his qualifications to be the one to preach and teach the gospel to the Gentiles, and takes the readers through those qualifications from his time as Christian killer Saul, through his conversion, to his time spent with Jesus himself, receiving the gospel and getting the call to take that gospel to the Gentiles. Paul next moves on in the letter to talk about a group of people who he says stealthily entered the church of the believers and brought a false doctrine. That group was called Judaizers, and they said that their doctrine had the blessing of the Christian church in Jerusalem. That doctrine said, among other things, that the gospel that Paul preached is true, but it is incomplete. That is, Christ was crucified and resurrection, but there's more. They said the road to salvation was not only to believe the one true gospel, but to also adhere to Mosaic law up to and including circumcision. Paul was telling them that they were wrong. And in this passage, in these verses, Paul recounts a situation that occurred between himself and Peter in Antioch earlier, and used that account to remind the readers and to show that the Judaizers were not preaching the one true gospel, and that their doctrine was wrong. What happened in Antioch was that when Peter and Paul were both there, when Peter was around the Gentiles, he had fellowship with the Gentiles, ate with the Gentiles, and interacted with them. But when the Jews came around, Peter dismissed himself from that group and hung around with the Jews. Paul had a problem with this because as Paul says, Peter knew the gospel and he knew the truth of the gospel, but he was in a situation, or put himself in a situation, to where the Jews' voice was just as powerful as the gospel, and the false doctrine they were preaching could be seen as true because Peter, who was the face of the Christian church at that time, was interacting with them and seemed to be in agreement with what they were teaching. Paul rebuked Peter publicly. He felt the need to rebuke Peter publicly and say, hey, I've been through hell and high water, have been beaten, have been stoned, have been whipped, have had people try to kill me, all for the sake of me spreading the gospel. And here you are in your position as the face of the Christian church, saying that, the Judaizers may be right, or at least giving that perception. He needed to stop that rot where it started. So Paul was willing to take on what we can see as the Christian church, the face of the Christian church in Peter, and he was willing to take on the society who would pervert the gospel to their wishes and their will and spread a false doctrine and stand firm in the one true gospel that he knew was true. Are you willing to stand firm in your belief in the one true gospel, even if it is in the face of the church and the society around you. We must stand firm. God bless.